That's Steve, not me. Okay, how you guys doing today? Coffee people, can you spread it around a little bit? Hey, it is great to have you with us here. I was with some friends last night, and it was kind of funny because they asked me, hey, are you teaching tomorrow? Oh, what are we teaching on? And I went, you go to the church, you kind of know which book we've been in for the last, and he actually knew, oh, no, you're in Mark 8, aren't you? And that's really important. It's like, okay, this guy's reading ahead. I like that. I hope all of you are reading ahead because Mark chapter 8 for me is literally the hinge point, the important chapter of, they're all important, right? But in this gospel, chapter 8 sits higher than all the rest and it hinges the rest of the book. Jesus is going to get to a place where he says, do you understand my mission, everybody? And then the moment they start to understand it, he's going to say, and this is how I'm going to accomplish it. And it changes their whole mindset of how he's going to pull this off. And so chapter 8 is really crucial. And so I don't know if you know where we've been. If you've been with us, we've kind of been just skating through the Gospel of Mark. And recently, in the last couple weeks, even though Jesus starts his teaching and his ministry out in the Galilee and Capernaum and then those kind of near surroundings, in the last couple weeks, he's branched out a little bit. A couple weeks ago, he went up to Tyre and Sidon, and he hung out with a woman. They call her the Syrophoenician woman because she's a pagan. She doesn't worship the one true God, and yet she comes to Jesus and wants something from him. And then from there, he travels down through the Galilee and then across the pond to the area of the Decapolis. And so there's a little thing here. And so we've talked about this before. The east side of the Sea of Galilee is the pagan nations. These people are not lovers of God. They love dogs, cats, animals, sun, moon, stars. They worship all kinds of weird created things, but they don't worship God. And so they're all over here. And this is not a great place. Jewish people would not wander into that place normally. But Jesus leaves kind of the place up north of the Sea of Galilee, that's not Jewish, and he goes through the Jewish area and goes right over to a place where the pagans live. And so we're beginning to see Jesus kind of branch out and reach out to people who, for the most part, Jewish people just did not hang out with at all. And it's kind of interesting that way. So that's where we're at. We're kind of moving toward this area. It's desolate. It's kind of like a mountain. There's not a lot of plants. There's not a lot of grass. It's a place where if people gathered, there would be nothing for them to eat or drink. It'd be a tough place to live. And so that's where we're at right now as we open up our story in Mark, why am I here? In Mark chapter 8. And usually I read the whole passage and then go back and talk about it, but it's so long, I'm going to chunk it up. And there are 4 real chunks of this passage. The first story part is something that we've heard before. He's done this miracle before. He feeds some people with some bread. Then he goes over and hangs out with some Pharisees, takes a long journey to hang out with them, spends only a brief moment with them, kind of shares some really important stuff. Then he goes back across the pond to another place, and he talks to the disciples, teaches them, never really comes to a point where I think he thinks they understand yet, and then he does another object lesson when he gets across the pond. And so there's 4 chunks, but Jesus is taking a nail and just driving it deeper and deeper and deeper into our souls, our spirits, helping us understand who he is and what he's all about. And so I think this is going to be fun, right? Yeah, okay, good. If I'm excited about it already. Now, literally, 2 of these chunks I really learned when I was in Israel with some people who have studied the Gospels for many, many years. The other 2 chunks, I had to dig down deep into the text and to the culture to understand because I just couldn't figure it out. Have you ever been there? You're reading through a Bible passage and you go, I don't get that. And so I was in that place, and so I dug deep, but I think I found something really interesting. So let's jump in. It's in Mark chapter 8. During those days, meaning the days that he went to the Decapolis, the area of the pagans, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" Does this story in any way sound familiar? Like if you've been with us, you know that something happened very similar to this just a few weeks ago. They were in a different place. They were actually on the other side of the pond. They were more in the Jewish section with Jewish people. Here they're in the Decapolis with Gentile, with pagan, with people who do not worship God. So it's a different setting, but a similar thing is happening. So he says to his disciples, "How many loaves do you have?" 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied, which is an interesting line because it's the exact same line that he uses just 2 chapters back about the people who were Jewish. The 5,000 Jewish people, the guys, and then the wives and the children, probably a group of 14 to 15,000 people. They all sat down, and with the loaves and fishes they had, they all ate and they were satisfied. The same thing happens with these people. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present, and having sent them away, he got into the boat, meaning Jesus, got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Here's one thing that's interesting. There's no explanation whatsoever. It's just something that happens, and Mark records it. He records the conversation with the disciples, and it's very similar to something we've seen before. Now, if you were here with us a couple weeks ago, I think I handed you bread in the beginning of the service. That was that service where we talked about Jesus ready to take his own disciples away to be with God the Father because they needed a little time of rest. They had just been out doing ministry, casting out demons, healing people, preaching the gospel, and they came back. They were so excited, and Jesus said, "Wow, that was really fun and exciting," and most people would just take off and do some more, but I realized that power, that doesn't come from you yourselves, that comes from God, and so you need to go spend some time alone with the Father and be re-energized, and so they tried to get away from everybody. So they got into a boat, and they kind of went along the coast, but everybody saw them from a distance, and they traveled with them, and so they couldn't get away with people, so when they landed, and they had all these people, like 10 to 15,000 people, Jesus basically said, "Okay, everybody's going to get stuff from my Father." And there was no food, and the disciples actually came to Jesus in that sense, like, which is puzzling to me. Why did the disciples, though they had been ministering and they were pretty tired, why did they come to Jesus and say, "Hey, Jesus, these guys have been with you and for a couple hours now, and if you don't send them away to the neighboring villages, they're not going to have food to eat, and we can't have that. You know, we care about these people." It's funny that in this text, when they're in the Gentile area, when they're in the pagan place, it's 3 days. They're with him for 3 days. And the disciples don't come and say, "Hey, Jesus, these guys are kind of hungry and we're in a desperate place. You know, you better send them away to get some food." They didn't do that on the first day. They didn't do that on the second day. And I got to be, is Jesus going, "Okay, what's wrong with my disciples? Why don't they care about these people? Why aren't they coming to me and saying, we're worried about them being hungry?" It's the 3rd day already, and the disciples have not come to Jesus to say, "You better send them away." They've just kind of said, "I don't care, let them starve." It's Jesus who says, "Hey, I have compassion upon these people." Well, what's the difference between the people? Why are the disciples not wanting to feed these people, these 4,000, it says in the text, 4,000 people, and then women and children? Well, let me just leave that question for you, okay? Think about that for a second. Now, it's interesting, there are differences in the story. There are some differences, and we're going to get to that. But right now, even think about what are some of the differences. Obviously, we said there's a different in the place. The Decapolis is where the Gentiles or the pagans live. Up in where the other story took place, where he fed 5,000, was the Jewish area, Jewish people he fed. The numbers of loaves are a bit different. The basketfuls of bread are a little different. The fact that Jesus has to say, "Hey, I have compassion. I want these guys to be fed," where the disciples haven't mentioned it at all. But the funny thing is, it just happens, and they get in the boat, and then they sail across the pond again. No discussion, no dialogue. I mean, it doesn't say the disciples were, oh my gosh, this is so amazing, because it did that when he was feeding the Jewish people over on the other side. They just get back in the boat, and they sail to the region of Dalmanutha. Now, this is a long haul. I've taken this little journey, and in a motorboat, it was about a 45-minute journey across the pond. And if you see just left of the arrow, there's a little black mark. That's a shadow from Mount Arbel, because the sun's up here, and it's casting the shadow from the mountain, the only mountain in the area, one of my favorite places in the world. So right at the foot of that mount is the region of Dalmanutha, and I think Matthew calls it Magdala. Magdala is kind of like the state, and then Dalmanutha would be the region of the state, and so that's where they're at. Now, where they're not in Gentile territory anymore, right? They're in the Jewish territory, and of course they come upon their friendly neighborhood Pharisees. I mean, these Pharisees are so kind to Jesus and his disciples. That's actually not the case. I was going to say something. They're mean. They're annoying, and they stay true to character here. Verse 11 says, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. I mean, Jesus can't even get out of the boat, and there they are. Big robes, big hats, and all their big beards, and they're just, Jesus. And he goes, can I just catch my breath here? I just had a lot of fun over there helping some people, and a long journey across the boat. I mean, I wasn't rowing, my dudes were rowing, but can I just take a little break, sit down by the fire, kick back a little bit, rest before you accost me? No, he can't. They began to question Jesus, to test him. So it's not like they're looking for an answer. They're not really questioning him because they want good answers so they can maybe believe in him or trust him or begin to follow him. They want to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. Interesting phrase there. Now, if you've been with us long enough, you know that the Pharisees have seen Jesus perform miracles in their midst, that he's cast out demons, he's healed people, he's healed a guy who was lowered from the roof, and he was paralyzed, and Jesus, pronounced that his sins were forgiven, and then he healed him, and the Pharisees were very angry. When he cast the demons out of the person in the synagogue, once again, the Pharisees were very angry. Every time the Pharisees see a miracle, they get angry, because oftentimes Jesus is healing people or caring for people or showing love and mercy to people who they don't think deserve it, right? They're Jewish folks, but they're Jewish people who don't follow the law very well. That's like a leper. I'm sure he's cursed by God because he's done something horrible, and so God gave him leprosy. He shouldn't be healed. We shouldn't care about him. He should be ostracized and set away. And so the Pharisees are that kind of a group of people. I mean, unlike Christians completely. Oh, back to the text. They asked him for a sign from heaven. Now, a sign from heaven is very different than just a sign of a miracle. And this is where because I've been reading this passage for a number of years, and I never figured out how it fit in the story. Like, Jesus has just cared for a bunch of Gentile people who don't follow God. He just fed 4,000 men, and then there's women and children, so there's probably 10,000 people. He's just fed them the same way he fed the Jewish people, and then he goes to see the Pharisees, and the Pharisees would say, we want a sign from heaven. And then I realized that the sign from heaven was a very unique sign. It was a sign that the Messiah was supposed to show in the end of all time, when God would send the Messiah, that the Messiah would throw off the oppressive people who've been holding the Jewish people down, much like the Egyptians did back in the Old Testament. He would throw those people off, and the Jewish people would then come into power again, and they would reign. And Joel and Ezekiel and Isaiah all talk about this time when a sign from heaven will be given, where the stars and the sun will no longer give their light, the moon will be turned to blood, and the great and dreadful day of the Lord. It's great for the Jewish people, it's dreadful for all the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are wiped away, and the Jewish people are put into power. What the Pharisees are asking, what they're testing Jesus is about, is, hey, are you the Messiah that we're looking for? Are you the one who's going to show the signs from heaven? Basically, throw off the Gentiles, wipe them out, and bring the Jewish people into power. Now, what do you think Jesus would say to that? I mean, he's just done an amazing miracle with the Gentiles. He's done that up for the Syrophoenician woman up in Tyre and Sidon, and then he's helped somebody else who was blind and couldn't speak, who was a Gentile. And then he comes to a group of people right after performing an amazing miracle for about 10,000 Gentiles, and they say, hey, are you going to wipe out the Gentiles now and put us into power? And he doesn't say that he wants to do that, in fact. And it's interesting. It says he sighs deeply. It's like the word is sighing deeply in his spirit. He's like, ugh. Now, if I'm Jesus, which I'm not, just clear that up. You probably know that, right? If I'm Jesus, I'm frustrated right now. I've used other words. Frustrated, we'll stick with that one. I'm frustrated. I've been showing who I am to these people in the sight of my disciples, in the sight of the Pharisees and the people who are leaders of the faith, and they are not getting it now to the point where, hey, are you going to finally wipe out the Gentiles and put us in power? And he goes, ugh. Why does this generation, and when he uses that phrase, he really kind of harkens back to the Old Testament times when there was an entire generation of people who would deny God and start following pagans again. They would renounce God and they would start worshiping the stars and the sun and all that. The whole generations would disappear from following God. And he says, you are just like those people. And it's really a play on words because he's saying, Ruth. You remember the book of Ruth? Naomi's one of her daughter-in-laws, and then there's another daughter-in-law, and their two husbands die, and so Ruth is going to go back to Israel. And she says to the two daughter-in-laws, you really, there's nothing for you in Jerusalem, and so what I want you to do is just stay here and find husbands of your own, and I'm going to go back to Jerusalem. And one of them takes that advice and she leaves. But the other one, Naomi, it's an interesting phrase that she uses. May God deal with me ever so severely if I ever leave you before I pass away. It's an oath. May God deal with me may God curse me if I ever reject you and leave you. This is the way Jesus sets this phrase up. But he doesn't use the phrase, may God deal with me ever so severely. But the second part of the oath is there. If I ever give that sign to this generation, what he's saying is, may God deal with me ever so severely if I ever cast off the Gentiles, if I ever wipe the Gentiles off and put the Jewish people in power again. That's not what I'm about. When the Pharisees hear this, they got to go, oh my gosh. Now, I've got to believe that the Pharisees were fairly upset when Jesus started healing lepers. Lepers were yucky in their eyes. Somebody who had the issue of blood, the woman, she was healed. And he was eating with tax collectors and sinners, notorious sinners, and the Pharisees hated it. But this is a completely different place. He's now not just blessing, showing grace, mercy, love to Jewish people. He's now opened it all up to the Gentiles as well. I will never destroy the Gentiles so that you can be put back in power. Understand that. May God deal with me ever so severely if I ever do that. Now, I got to believe the Pharisees just went, oh, I can't believe he just said that. But what are the disciples feeling? Like the disciples didn't seem to understand a lot of what's gone on so far. Jesus would do something and they would be kind of dense, just kind of thick. They wouldn't figure out who Jesus was or what he was doing. And this is at a point where now they're probably beginning to think, wait a second, what is Jesus doing? I'm really excited about the fact that he reached out to me, a fisherman, or me, a tax collector, but now to go so far as to start blessing the Gentiles? I mean, I wonder why the disciples never came to Jesus. Hey, man, it's been 2-3 days. You need to feed these guys. I know you can do it. I would just give you some bread and you multiply it. It's amazing. They never came to Jesus to ask. Jesus had to say, I have compassion on these people. And so we're going to feed them. He told the Pharisees, we are never going to wipe out the Gentiles and put you in power. That's not what I'm about. And so after this, they get back in the boat. And here begins kind of the lesson that he teaches. It says that the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Now, here's an interesting thing, and this is, once again, this little narration is so interesting. Forgotten, the word translated forgotten, is only used one time in the New Testament, so sometimes it's hard to translate. It is often used in it's called the Septuagint. It's sort of the Greek version of the Old Testament. It's used like 122 times. 100 of those times, it's not the idea of unintentionally forgetting, like, oops, I forgot to turn the coffee pot off, or oops, I forgot my keys, or it's not like, oops, it's not that. It's like planning to forget so that the outcome won't take place. So it's interesting. A very important scholar, at least I've read a lot of his stuff, he says it's very possible that the disciples have decided not to bring any bread because when Jesus says, hey, we're going to go back to the other side, they think, we're going to go back to the Gentile area, let's not take anything for them. Which is really shocking. But it follows when Jesus starts ripping them. Right? I'm so angry with the Pharisees. Now I'm a little frustrated with you guys. And he starts asking them questions. Well, first he says, be careful. So they've only brought one loaf of bread. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And this is funny, I think. And so the disciples discussed with one another and said, oh, it's because we have no bread. What do you think Jesus is doing right now? Oy vey. They really aren't seeing it. Now, my understanding is if the disciples literally just brought one loaf of bread thinking, if we go back to the Gentile area, I don't want to feed them, I don't want to help them, I don't want to bless them. I'm not comfortable with where Jesus is going with this thing. That's possible. Then when he says, be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod, and he's saying to them, if you're beginning to have an attitude like they have, like we want to wipe the Gentiles out and we want to be put in power, you got to understand that's not where I'm going. That's not what I'm about. But then he begins this list of questions. Why are you talking about having no bread? And then these words, do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Now remember, Jesus has only used those phrases for people who have been outside of the family. For Pharisees and scribes and people who didn't understand his mission. Do you not see? You have eyes, but you're clearly not seeing. Do you not understand this? Are your hearts so hardened that you're not beginning to see the mission that I'm on? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? This is, he's really reaming them. He's very uncomfortable with where they're at in their attitudes and what they're thinking about as they cross the pond to go back, what they think, to the Gentile region. And then he asks them interesting questions. And you probably know the answers to these, right? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? Do you remember that story? So there's 5 loaves, 2 fish. They handed out to everybody. They sat down. They all ate, and they were satisfied. And the disciples gathered up how many basketfuls of bread? 12. Now, what does 5 mean in the Bible, usually? 5 is kind of an important number, especially for a Jewish person, a Jewish kid. It's the 5 books of Moses. So the Torah, Genesis, I always forget this in order. Genesis, Exodus, what's next? And then, okay, that's the 5, right? That's the Torah. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible. The Torah, the Word of God, the presence of God, the blessing of God, the grace of God, the goodness of God to teach his people how to live. That's the Torah. That's the 5. Do you ever remember when there was a kid who slayed a giant and he grabbed some stuff out of a little stream? Do you remember what he grabbed? Yeah, 5 smooth stones. Do you think 5 has anything to do with... No, I'm sure it's a coincidence. No, actually, numbers really mean something in the Bible. He's trying to tell a story. If Goliath, you look at the scales and how much everything weighed, it's all about the enemy of our souls. It's kind of an interesting study. But 5 is Torah. It's God's word. It's God's blessing. It's God's covenant with his people. And so the 5 fed everyone, and they were satisfied, and then there were 12 basketfuls of bread that were picked up afterwards. What does 12 usually represent? The tribes of Israel, God's people, right? The 12 sons of Israel, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And so my understanding of this, and people who travel in Israel a lot and understand their culture and their context, would say what Jesus was trying to say to his disciples and to the people who were there is that God has come to satisfy his people, his chosen people. And then he goes on. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many? 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? And I would ask the same question. Do you not understand now? Got it? Get it? Okay, let's move on. Now, what is he talking about? What is he trying to teach them? What is he trying to help them understand? What is 7? Yeah, everybody goes with that completion thing, and that's a good one because, right, 7 days, on the 7th day, he let us rest, and so he completed the entire universe in 7 days, and then we rested. But for a Jewish person, that number is important, but there's also a number that's kind of connected to the promised land and the way Joshua was able to push out all the pagan nations from the promised land, and they pushed them to the other side of the pond. And it was actually 7 nations that he pushed across. And Joshua says, you will see the hand of the Lord upon you when you push these, or when you drive out these 7 nations from the promised land. And it's the Hittites and the Hivites and the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites, all those ites. There's 7 of them. And so when a Jewish person thought about that side of the Sea of Galilee and the number 7, what they immediately thought of, oh my gosh, these are the 7 pagan nations that used to be a part of our promised land. And God and God's hand allowed us to drive them out. So when Jesus takes 7 loaves of bread and feeds everyone and gathers 7 back, and the disciples hear that number, they should say, oh my gosh, God is doing a new thing here. He is obviously going to feed his people. He's going to take care of his people. His covenant is with his people. But it appears like that has now been expanded to include even the Gentiles. Ew. Could that be possible? That Jesus would expand his love to not just include the chosen ones, the people of God, but now he's going to show mercy and grace and love and blessing to the Gentiles? Do you understand? Do you understand Jesus' mission? Do you understand that he did not just come, thank God, for the Jewish people, but he opened it up for us as well, those of us who are not Jewish? That's why we get to stand here and worship God and know him, is because he opened it up. But the first time he did it, the disciples were not real happy about it. They were not understanding it at all. In fact, they may have not wanted to go back there. And so actually they didn't go back there. They instead went back to Peter and Andrew and Philip's hometown. Now, think about this for a second. Like if I was thinking, okay, if I was following Jesus and I took Jesus back to Elmore, what would it be like? You know, I mean, we come up the hill, you know, where the Dairy Queen was on the left and the bank's on the right. And my uncle used to own the Dairy Queen, so we were there all the time. And he owned the Portage Inn and then the bowling alley. And so we had a lot of fun back in Elmore. And so I'd like, okay, hey, Jesus, you want to go to the Dairy Queen? We'll get an ice cream cone. We'll go have a drink at the bar, and we'll go bowl a little bit. Or play pool maybe. Or, I think they're having an asteroids game there in the lobby. And Jesus would say, yeah, cool. I mean, I'll have some wine. You know, I can turn some water into wine and it'll be fine. But and I'll give it to everybody. But here's the funny thing. Jesus gets there with his disciples, and especially 3 of them, that it's their hometown. And he doesn't stay in there. It says he walks into the town, And once he gets in there, something happens. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. And so instead of just saying, okay, I'll take care of that right now, he grabs the guy by his hand. Okay, so he's, oh, yeah, sure, but here, come with me. This isn't going to be like a public spectacle. Disciples, come with me. I got to show you something. Come here. And he grabs him by the hand. He takes him outside the city. And he has his disciples all around, and he's going to teach them a lesson here. This is the best object lesson in the world. And so he spits in his eye. He cleans his eye and says, okay, what do you see? What do you see? I see some maybe people, but they're walking around like trees. And he looks to his disciples, do you understand that? And then he spits in his eye again. And what do you see now? And what does the Bible say? It says, I love this phrase. His eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Now, this is, I think, what he's trying to say to his disciples. Every time you see blindness in the Bible, it's often physical blindness, but it often refers to a spiritual blindness in their lives as well. What I think he's trying to say to his disciples is, the first time I spit in his eye and kind of rubbed a little bit, and he saw people, but he saw them as trees. I think that's where you're at right now. I don't think you understand my mission, what I've come to accomplish, and the love that I'm ready to share with the world. I think you still think the way kind of the Pharisees do, that I'm kind of right here, I'm going to focus on this group, but remember the woman up there in Sidon, and she asked, and I blessed her. I came over here, I remember I cast demons out of a guy, came back, did the same thing. I fed all of those people the same way I fed your Jewish buddies. My love is so much larger than that, but right now I don't think you see clearly. Second time, sight is restored. His eyes are open. He sees clearly. You see, I think at times I don't see clearly. I don't see the enormity of Jesus' love for absolutely everyone on the planet. See, I think in some way I try to limit his love to people that I prefer him to love. I think that was the Pharisees' problem. I think the disciples were struggling with it too. And I know I often struggle with it. Now, luckily, the church no longer struggles with that so much. We're not hypocrites. We're not judgmental. We're not condemning. We're not any of those things. And you aren't either, right? I was talking to somebody after the first service. He was literally having a conversation with a guy who was a pastor's son and who has not been to church for many years because he said, people in the church are so judgmental. Yep. Here's the funny thing. I don't think Jesus was. I think Jesus reached out to people whose lifestyle that he would not agree with. He would not affirm. He would not immediately say yes to the way they live their life or the way they worship God or the way they treat other people or anything like that. But he still said, my Father's love is big enough and expansive enough to cover them. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm getting to the point where in my life, I think, I'm 75 now. Turned 75 a couple days ago. And at this point in my life, what I see in the scripture about Jesus often shocks me. Like going through the Gospel of Mark has been so good for me because when I see Jesus, I realize what he's calling us to. Now, next week, we're all going to be talking about what he's calling us to really, because I think he shocks the world and certainly his disciples when he says, okay, now that you understand my mission, this is how I'm going to accomplish it. And they just go, what? In fact, Peter does say that. No. But he calls us into that mission the same way that he is going to accomplish it. But I just want to say, talking to my friend, he said, His dad was a pastor. He'd been out of the church for 30 years, and this is what he said: I'm not going back to the church because all of them are so judgmental. Now, I don't know where your heart is or how you look at other people, but the way I see Jesus seeing other people is that there is room enough somehow, even in his holiness, to love everyone, to bless everyone, to show grace to everyone. And around here, I want to be a place where that happens all the time. I was thinking a couple weeks ago, a friend of mine was invited his relatives to come to the church. And if I were to, say what their lifestyle is, many of you would say, "Oh, I don't affirm that. I don't agree with that. That's not good." And I thought, how is that going to play out here? And I was a little concerned about it. And then I just said, okay, now I know this place. I know that many of us have come out of backgrounds that are not all that colorful. Actually, they are colorful. They're not all that good. And I think we'll be a group of people who will say, you know what, I came to Jesus not by anything that I did, not that anything that I earned, solely by his grace. And so I want to be able to, no matter who walks into these walls, to show that kind of grace and hope that it's the kindness of God and the love of Jesus that draws people to himself, and maybe not so much the condemning nature of our judgmental spirits, my own judgmental spirit. And I think Jesus just took that idea and drove it deep into our hearts. No, there's not a group of people that I'm going to cast off so I can put some other group in power. I'm going to share love and grace and blessing with every group of people, try to draw them to myself. And the moment they make a repentant prayer of surrender, I will welcome them into the family. That's his message. Next week we talk about how he's going to accomplish that mission. Let's pray.